What's up everyone? Welcome back to the series. In this video, we're going to be looking at testing, which is basically a way for us to be assured of the workings of our API. We've so far been doing manual testing by the use of tools such as RESTFox. Now you can use tools like Postman or Insomnia that can pretty much do the same thing to make requests to our API and return responses from those requests. We're going to be looking at automated tests that are going to allow us to basically have code that will run and test whether our application works the same way in all circumstances. So we're going to be, first of all, writing unit tests, and unit tests are simply going to be code to test specific functionality or endpoints within our application. And to end this video, we're going to be using a tool that is called Schemathesis. So Schemathesis is going to help us to run code throughout our entire application, generate tests based off our API documentation or API specification. So to begin, we're going to install Pytest. So right here in my code, I'm going to go ahead and run pip install Pytest. And once I've installed Pytest, I'm now going to go ahead and set up Pytest to work with the application. So to do that, we are going to come within our folder, which is our source folder right here. I'm going to create a new folder that I'm going to call tests. So inside tests, I'm going to create a Danda init.py file. And this is going to mark this as a package since we're going to be importing very many objects from our application. So another thing we're going to do is to write a file called the conf test file. So this is going to be specific to setting up Pytest to work with our tests. So this is where we're going to do things such as overriding dependencies, setting up fixtures, and stuff like that. So the first thing we're going to do is to first think of functionality that we may mock or functionality that we may create fixtures for. One example is going to be the code for connecting to our database. Now, if you've not been following this series, all the code for connecting to our database is going to come from our source main.py, and we are basically using our get session object which we are getting from this get session function right here. So we are calling this as a dependency in every route that actually needs to have this dependency, which is not what we're going to do for our test because we need to make sure our tests run faster and do not connect to our database. So for us to go ahead and mock that functionality, we're going to be overriding that dependency. So we are going to do that by first of all using our app instance that we created to override that dependency using a mock dependency that we shall set up. So to begin, we're going to import that function. So I'll say from source.db.main, we're going to go ahead and import the get session function. And once we've imported it, we're going to now go ahead and mock it. So to mock it, we're going to be making use of Unittest.mock, and we shall go ahead and import a class called mock. So this mock class is one that's going to help us to create all mock session or all mock objects that we're going to use for our tests. So I'm just going to come right here and say the mock session object is going to be an object of type mock. But for us to go ahead and return it just like we return our get session dependency, then we have to return it or yield it from a function. So we're going to go ahead and create this as get session. But in this case, this is going to be returning a get mock session. Now, if you're not understanding this, you're going to understand it in a minute. So what we are doing here is to go ahead and yield this mock session object, similar to the way that we yielded our session that we're using within our routes, or similar to the way that we created our session object. So once we've yielded this, then FastAPI is going to help us to override that dependency such that each time we run our tests, we are not running them on our existing database. So to do that, we're going to come and import our app instance. So I'll just come at the top and say from source dot, in this case, I think it's located within our main source folder. And once we've accessed that app instance, we now just need to go ahead and override that dependency so that we don't use it. If you confused about the dependency I'm talking about, that is the dependency that we are providing for each of the times we are using our session objects. So this is the get session dependency, but in case we want to override it, we're going to be replacing it with a get mock session. So yeah, hope you've understood that. So once we've imported our app, we need to just go ahead and call the dependency overrides. And this dependency overrides is a dictionary that takes in a key as the name of the dependency you are providing. So for our case, if we provide the get session, we can now update it with the value of our get mock session. And that is just enough for us to entirely override that specific get session dependency so that we use the get mock session dependency. Once we've been able to do that, we can now go ahead and also create a fixture, which is simply data with initial values that we can use for testing. Now that's going to be the fixture for our mock session or our fake session. So to do that, we're going to be making use of Pytest, and Pytest is going to help us create a decorator that will decorate the function to return that specific fixture. So I'll go ahead and import Pytest. And once I've imported Pytest, I can go ahead and say at Pytest.fixture. So we can create a function and name that function whatever we may want. Now I'll just call this the fake session object. And this fake session is just simply going to have the value of the mock session. We can pretty much do this for other functions. So for example, if we want to create a fake user service object that we use for, let's say, let me show you actually. When you go to our source auth, we have the user service class. We can also create a fake user service object that shall have all these methods so that we can check if those were actually called within our code. So to do that, I can just simply come right here and say that our mock user service is going to be equal to a mock object. And once we've created this mock user service, we can go ahead and also create a fixture for it by saying at Pytest.fixture. And for our case, we can simply create that as def fake user service. So this is going to be returning our mock user service. So you may ask, why are we using mock objects, or why are we going to even set up these mock objects in the first place? So these mock objects are going to be used for testing to allow us to skip those parts that need us to interact with our database. So instead of going ahead and testing SQL Alchemy or SQL model, we have the assurance that these are already tested, and therefore we need to test the code that we've written ourselves. So that's why I'm setting up these dependencies or setting up these mock objects for the code that we've written ourselves. So I'm not going to check for things like, let's say, data being saved, or we can actually go ahead and call and check if those methods are being called without having to check if our data is actually saved, because that is automatically done for us. So to set up our first tests, we are going to go ahead and also create a test client, which is going to be the medium through which FastAPI or Pytest is going to send requests to the API and test it. So to do that, we are going to import the test client class actually that's going to be provided from FastAPI. So I'll say from FastAPI dot test client, we are going to go ahead and import the test client. And once we've imported the test client, we can also create a fixture for it so that we do not repeat ourselves, or so that we don't actually go ahead and call it a lot of times. So I can just come right here and say at Pytest.fixture. And for our case, we can simply go ahead and call this our test client. So this test client is going to be a test client object, but it's going to be the one that's returned from our app. So the test client object is going to require us to provide the app instance, which is going to be our app instance right here. So once this is done, now let's go ahead and write our tests. So I'm going to come right here and create a module or a file, which I'm going to call test auth.py. Now this test auth.py is simply going to have code for some endpoints on our authentication. To start, I'm going to create a function that's going to test for our user creation. So I can call this test user creation. And this is going to take in all the fixtures that we're going to need to test that. So to test this, we need to go ahead and provide our fixtures. So we've created 3 fixtures. One is for the fixation, the fake user service, as well as the test client. I'm going to go ahead and provide those because we are going to be using them to make assertions about the behavior of our app. So I'm going to come right here, and the first thing I'll have to provide is going to be our fixation, and then we shall also provide our fake. So this will be our fake user service. Once we provided our fake user service, we shall also need the fake test client or the test client fixture. So once those are done, and once those are written the way they are here, so you have fake session, fake user service, and test client, we can now go ahead and use them. So I need to go ahead and first of all make a request to our API using our fake or our test client that we've set up. So to do that, I'm going to come right here and create a response object. So this is going to make use of our test client. So it's going to be test client, and then we can call a method. So our method is going to be the post method. Now this post method is going to be having the URL or the path on which we need to write our test. So I'm going to create the version or the prefix. So the prefix is going to be the part that's going to uniquely identify all the auth endpoints. So I can just say this is going to be our auth prefix, and this auth prefix is going to be on the /API/version1 and then /auth. So I can just go ahead and make this an f string where we shall have our prefix coming first. So we shall have our auth prefix, and then we can go ahead and call the sign up path. I think that's the one for creating a user account, just like the one we have here. Another thing we need to do is to provide the JSON that's going to be used to create the user account. Now this is going to be the JSON, so I can copy it from here and then I provide it here. So I'll say JSON is going to be equal to our JSON. Now once this is done, we are sure that our client has made a post request with our data to the API. Now let's go ahead and make some assertions about the response or the functions that are going to be called. So I'm going to come right here, and all I have to do is to first of all call assert. And for our case, we're going to call if our fake user service called a specific method we set up for creating our user. Now to do that, we can actually hide this inside its own dictionary. So instead of going ahead and providing it directly, I can come and provide it as our sign up data. And then when you have the sign up data here, you can go ahead and call our JSON. So we can provide our JSON as our sign up data. And once we've provided our JSON as our sign up data, we can now go ahead and simply check if the fake user service was used to create our user in the database with the credentials that we provided right here. So if we go within our service.py of our auth, we see that create user is what we are using to create our user. Another thing we need to do is to check if the checks for our user existing are also made. So if we go within our route for our auth, we shall notice that the endpoint for creating a user account first of all checks if our user exists, and that takes in the email as well as the session. Now this is very important. Instead of testing the obvious things like the status codes and all that, we can go ahead and test to see if our functions are being called in the right way with the right specific arguments or parameters. So for our case, I'm going to call the fake user service, and I'm going to check if the user exists method, which we have right here, is called. So to do that, I can just come right here and say fake user service dot user exists, and then we can simply call the called once. So this is going to be the one to test if the function was at all called during the execution of our tests. Now the magic is happening here. Since we are not making any calls to our database, we do not expect this to be called, but when we go ahead and mock them, they will be actually called. So if I pull up my terminal and run Pytest, so this will go ahead and automatically discover the tests that we've written and also run any existing tests. So for our case, we see that this function has been called. We can also go ahead and check if it was called with the data that we've set up. So we can do that by asserting fake user service.user exists called once, and then can add with. So we can say we are checking if the fake user service.user exists method was called once with a specific parameter or a specific argument. Now for our case, we want that to be our email. So we actually have that taking in both our email and our session. So I'm going to come right here and provide our email. So that's going to be our sign up data, and then we can get the email, and then we can provide our fake session since it also requires to have that. So when we provide those and run our tests again, we shall notice that our tests are going to still pass, which means that our fake user service is being called, and then our user exists is being called once with the same data that we set up. Another thing we want to do is to check if our create user method is also being called. So for that case, we can simply do the same thing that we've done here. And well, for this case, this is going to take in the data for creating the user. So for our case, instead of calling user exists, in our case, we're going to call create user, since that's the name of the method. And then we shall also call this, or call the create user called once with, and we shall provide the data. So we're going to see how we're going to do this, because this is actually where it gets interesting. So instead of calling user existed, we shall call create user, and then we have to provide the data in here. So I'm going to go back to our service, and when you check this, it requires the user data, but this has to be of type user create model. Now we need to go ahead and create an object of type user create model. So I'll go at the top of our tests and I'll import that class. So that's going to be from our auth. Actually, we shall say from source.auth.schemas. We shall import our user create model. And once that has been got, then we can simply unpack the sign up data and create the object of our sign up data. So we can just come right here, and all we can do is to just say our user data is going to be equal to our user create model, and we can go ahead and unpack the values from our sign up data. So we can just come right here and unpack our sign up data. Once that is done, we shall have our user data object. So we need to call the create user with the create user data and the session. So I'm just going to come right here and provide the sign up data, or what we call the user data. And after that, we shall just go ahead and also provide our session. And this is going to go ahead and simply provide our data, just like you see right there. So we've successfully ran our tests, and we've done this in a very clean way, one that does not make database calls, and one that helps us to check if our methods are actually being called correctly. Now I'm going to also be showing you how we can maybe test our endpoints for authorization. So to do that, we have to first override the dependencies for our authorization. So let's go to our books endpoints. Our book endpoints are all protected. We need a token to access them, and one of the dependencies is the role checker. We also need to get the access token bearer. So what we can do is to just come and simply override them inside here. So we can just come right here and say app.dependency overrides, and then we can provide our role checker. So and just come right here, provide the role checker, and this is going to have a mock role checker. So we can simply also go ahead and check and provide that. So our mock role checker can be a mock object. So I can just simply come and create a mock object, but then I need to create a role checker object. So I can go ahead and first of all import that. So I can say from source.auth dot dependencies, we can go ahead and import the respective dependency classes. So the access token bearer, the role checker, and then we can also have our refresh token bearer. So once those have been imported, I can go ahead and create their objects. So here we can have the access token bearer. And this is going to be our access token bearer, which shall be this specific object. And then we can go ahead and provide the refresh token bearer. So that's going to also be the one for, actually this shall be our refresh token bearer. So just going to come and say refresh token bearer, and this will be an object of that class. Then we can also create our role checker, and that will be our role checker. Now let's go ahead and override this. So far overriding the role checker. Now we need to do the same thing for the refresh token bearer. So I'll provide that, and that will be for our refresh token bearer. So once that is done, we can now go ahead and set up or write tests for those specific endpoints. Let's say our book endpoints. So our book endpoint has a fake user book or a fake book service object. So we're going to actually look at how we test that. So I can just go ahead and create a mock book service object for testing. And this will also be a mock object. Once I've been able to do that, then I can simply create a fixture for it, just like I did for the fake user service. And I'll then go ahead and provide our book. So this will be fake book service, and this will be mock book service. So once that is done, let's now go ahead and create our tests. So I can go within our test folder right here and create a new file. So that's going to be our test books.py. So let's start by testing the endpoint for getting all our book objects. So to do that, we can first of all create the function. So I'll create this as test get all books. And still we have to provide the fixture. So our fixture is going to be first of all a test client. And when we provide the test client, we shall have to go ahead and also get the mock book service or the fake book service. So I'll provide it right here. Once that is done, I think we are going to need anything? We have the test client. I think we need to also get the fake session. So once we've got the fake session, now we can go ahead and test that specific endpoint. So I can do the same thing that we did for our tests for the auth, where I can go ahead and create the prefix. So our prefix, in this case, we're going to have this being the book prefix. So I can just come right here, call this the books prefix, and then we can create our response. So our response is going to be equal to our fake book or our test client, because that's what we're making our request with, .get, and then we want to specify that our URL is going to be the API prefix itself or the book prefix that we've created. So shall just come right here and say this is going to be our books prefix. So once we provided that, then we can simply go ahead and make our assertion. So we can assert whether our fake book service dot get all books. I wonder if that's the method that we use to crawl our books, or it's the one that we actually went ahead and used to get all our books. So we can just say called once, and then we can simply go ahead and provide the call once with our session. So I think we can just go ahead and copy what we have here, paste it, and then we can call called once with, and then we can provide our fake session object. So when we finish writing this, we can now go ahead and run our Pytest. Now we see that we have one error. So here we have loud roles. So I think I need to go ahead and override that with a default kind of role. So I can just come right here, create this, and let's say provide admin, and then save. And when I run the tests, we shall now see that our tests have been run. So I hope you've got an entire idea about how we can write our unit tests to test the different functionalities within our application. We can also see that we've been able to override dependencies and set up fixtures to help us run our tests. While this approach seems to work, it is tiresome in a way that in case we are to change our API, we shall also need to change the tests that we have written for our API. When maintaining our application, we are always going to be having a need to rewrite our tests so that we make them pass for the existing features that we've made changes to. And that is a really frustrating way to test your API. So that's where document-driven API testing is going to come in. So in the previous video, we looked at how we could document our API, or how FastAPI goes ahead and generates a schema for our API. Using that, we can go ahead and look at how we can generate documentation out of that specific schema. So if we go to our browser, we shall see that we have our OpenAPI specification. Now I'm going to basically browse to /API/version1/OpenAPI.json because we set up its path. So I can simply navigate there. So it's going to be on the /OpenAPI.json. And this will give us the API specification. So this API specification is simply a way that we've set up to document our API, how it should work, what form of responses shall be returned, whether a certain endpoint requires authorization or not. All that information is found within our OpenAPI schema. Now, there are very many ways to test APIs, and I've been really excited about one that I've found out lately, which requires us to have our OpenAPI schema set, and then using that OpenAPI schema, we can actually generate tests, and those tests can be just enough for us to run them on our application. So that's where Schemathesis comes in. Schemathesis requires us to have our OpenAPI specification set, and using that OpenAPI specification, we can now go ahead and run tests on our application. So to start, we're going to install it. I head over to my terminal right here, and then what I'll do is to say pip install Schemathesis. So this will go ahead and install Schemathesis. And once Schemathesis has been installed, we can now go ahead and use Schemathesis within our application. So Schemathesis works in the following way. All we need to do is to have Schemathesis installed, and when we have Schemathesis installed, we shall just point it to our OpenAPI specification. And after providing our OpenAPI specification, it will go ahead and generate tests based off what we specified in that spec. So if you come right here and run st, we can now see the different options that have been provided for us. So st is short for Schemathesis, but then we can also go ahead and say Schemathesis, and then we shall see the same options being returned. Now let us run our tests. So to use Schemathesis, you don't actually need to write any tests, but rather what you need to have is your OpenAPI specification. I'm going to copy this path or this URL right here, and all I'll do is to go ahead and run Schemathesis using our documentation. So I'll just come right here and say Schemathesis run, and then I'll point to our OpenAPI.json, and that will go ahead and run tests over our API. Now the problem is FastAPI uses OpenAPI version 3.1.0, which hasn't yet been fully supported by Schemathesis. But for us to go ahead and run our tests, all we have to do is provide that specific part of experimental, and that is going to point to our OpenAPI version. So we shall say OpenAPI version 3.1. And when we run it, we shall now see it's going to collect all our API and generate tests based off our API, and then you to go ahead and make checks on different kinds of things. So we're going to look at how it's going to do that. So just like you see, it's making requests to our API on all our API endpoints, and it's going to check for various things such as conformance to our documentation in status codes, schemas, and all that stuff. Just like you see, our tests have been run and we've seen that there are errors that exist on our API. But the beauty about this is we do not actually go ahead and write tests. All these tests are automatically generated using our specification. And then Schemathesis will go and basically test our app. After testing our app, it will then show us errors, and those errors are basically ones that are got from running our app. So Schemathesis works in a way that your API has to be running, and then it will go ahead and send data, make requests using various conditions for your API, so that you can go ahead and check for those test cases that you never wrote, or check for where errors may arise where you did not actually think of. So for example, we are getting errors, but all those errors are originating from wrong data maybe being sent to one endpoint. So if you do not set that up, of course, you're going to be getting errors, but those errors are not errors you will get in case you are to write your test cases. So I'm going to stop our server right here. And what I'll do is to run it again. By this time, I'm going to run Schemathesis in a different way. So Schemathesis basically uses certain checks to determine the kind of tests to write to our application. And those tests can be things for checking whether an endpoint does not return a server error, whether it returns the specific code that's specified within our OpenAPI spec, and so much more. For us to specify that, we have to run our Schemathesis command, but we need to provide the checks attribute. So you can go ahead and provide checks, and then you can provide all checks, and this will go ahead and run our app, provide for us basically tests, and those tests will be for the different checks. Now when you run all checks, we shall now see that some tests or majority of our tests are actually failing. So this gives us the ability to go and check our code, check our documentation to see that it conforms to what our tests are actually telling us. So for example, we can see that not a server error. There are some endpoints that are actually returning server errors, and those are actually not a lot of endpoints because we have a lot of we actually have some of them failing, status code conformance, whether endpoints are returning the right status codes according to the documentation, whether response headers are set correctly, whether response schemas are set correctly, or whether negative data has been rejected by our API. So if you want to go ahead and run a much more robust test on your application, you can go ahead and check out Schemathesis, and it was simply one tool that I found interesting and one that we could recommend for thorough testing our API before we ship it to production. In this video, we've looked at how we could test APIs. We began with the traditional approach of writing unit tests, where we looked at things such as setting up fixtures and mocking our objects. We've also gone ahead and looked at Schemathesis, which is a tool that helps us to generate documentation from our OpenAPI specification. Now I'm going to leave you the task of figuring out what the best way to test your API is. You can give me an idea about it in the comment section below, and I'm going to write the tests of the code. So if you're interested in checking out the majority of the tests or checking out the rest of the tests, you'll find them in the GitHub repo that is linked down in the description below. I hope to see you in the next video where we're going to deploy our application. See you in the next one. Bye.